Imagine being able to make your designs feel 80% better with only 20% extra effort. That is the effect that well thought out typography can have on the quality of your visual design. We're going to take a look at 3 core techniques that will not only make your design feel clearer and well considered, but enhance the reading experience for your end users. And if you stick around to the end of the video, I'll show you how to apply all of these to build a set of reusable design tokens. Let's start by looking at type scales. Type scales are a great way to create harmony across the different text styles that you use within your product or website. Here we have an example type scale that is used for this sample product, and we have 4 different heading styles. We have the main body text style, and we have a style here for meta text and one for action text, which would primarily be used for CTAs. One thing I've found is, to begin with, keeping your type scale as concise as possible really helps eliminate the choice when it comes to selecting a text style when you're designing your product. So by having a handful of headings and main body text and just some additional text styles for those isolated cases, you don't give yourself so much choice that you become overwhelmed as to which font size and font style to choose. This way, you can create a consistent reading experience across your product. One thing I often find useful to start with is using a generated type scale as the base. So the type scales plugin for Figma is a great way to do that. Now, I tend to go with the major third scale. So that's a 1.25 from a base size of 16. Line height I'll keep as default. Number of scales above, so we'd set that to 4 because we have 4 heading styles. Number below, we'll leave that as 2 because it's just 1 or 2 for the meta text and the action text. And then we can generate that as a starting point. So this is super useful as a quick way to get going with an established type scale using the base value of 16. So we know that the 16 pixel font size is perfect for having accessible and legible text. So we don't want to go any lower than that as that base size. Although we do have styles below that for special scenarios. But in general, we like to use the 16 pixels as a base to ensure that we are keeping within those accessible bounds. So if we take a look at the font sizes that have been applied to each of these text styles, although they work to the scale that we've selected, they aren't quite there in terms of the actual values that I would personally like to use. And this is because I tend to stick to the 4-point grid system. So you might think that you just use the 4-point grid system when it comes to spacing out and creating a layout for your interface. I personally like to use the 4-point grid system in an extended way and apply that to actual font sizing, line height, just to give it that fully cohesive experience when it comes to presenting everything on page. So if you're always using the 4-point grid system to space things out, to apply to your text sizing, not only does it feel more intentional and joined up in terms of the overall feel of the interface, but it actually makes it a lot easier and a lot more straightforward for you when it comes to actually designing and putting together these different font sizes, because you're never guessing as to which one's going to be right, because you're working to that 4-point grid system. So we're going to just make some tweaks here. So instead of just using the 39, we're going to round that up to the next nearest point in the 4 times table, which effectively is the 4-point grid system. Again, 31, we're going to go to 32. 25, we're going to go down to 24. 20 is fine, 16 is obviously fine. 13 and 10. So this is where we might differ slightly. Now, because we don't want the jump from the 16 pixel body style to be so drastic when it gets down to that level down in terms of the meta text, because we want it still to be readable and legible to some degree, we're just going to go to 14 for that. So again, we're sticking with an even number and just dropping down by 2 so it's still readable. And for 10, which is this one's going to be our button style, I'm going to break the pattern completely here and go with 15. So for heading 1, we'll start with a line height that is 1.25 times 32. So that equates to 125% of the font size is the value that we use here for the line height. Now this isn't an exact science, and it is loosely based on the major third type scale, and it's something that does shift slightly as I move down these different heading styles, but I do normally start with that for the top level heading to create a pattern that you'll see that starts to emerge as we move down the different heading styles. And the key thing here is that 40 pixels is 2 stops above 32 on the 4-point grid system. And that's exactly the pattern that I tend to use going forward for every other font style within the type scale. So for heading 2, that's a 24 pixels in size, and then we jump up 2 steps on that 4-point grid to get to 32. Again, heading 3 is 20, 2 steps up is 28, and so on. So heading 4, 16 up to 24. And what this allows for, again, is a level of consistency and predictability for both the reader and you as the designer when it comes to setting these line height values. And we'll see that pattern continues through into the body text styles. So just like the heading 4, we have a 16 pixel size for the body text, and then 2 steps above that, we've got the 24 pixel line height. Now, again, this pattern shifts slightly when it comes to the meta and action text. We try and keep it as consistent as possible given the font sizes that we're working with. So because we're stepping down 2 pixels for the font size when it comes to the meta text, we're going to drop down to the next level down in terms of the line height on the 4-point grid. So that's down to 20, and then action text, we're going back up to 15, which is just one shy of the body text main style. So we're going back to 24 for the line height there. So if we take this sample design, not much has been applied in terms of typography styles. So you can see the structure is lacking a little bit. So we can use our type scale that we've previously defined and start to apply some consistent styles to improve this interface fairly quickly. So the first thing I tend to do is go for the text style that has the most amount of content on the page. And what this will do is it'll instantly give you feedback in terms of the majority of that text you see is now going to be applied using consistent styles and is a good basis for moving forward. And it makes sense to use the body text, so that's 16 pixels standard text size when it comes to applying this technique. A quick disclaimer, I'm not going to use any built-in Figma variables or styles to begin with, because I want to focus specifically on the values and why we use the numbers that we do. If we select everything that we deem to be part of this body style, take everything here to begin with, we can always make changes where needed, but we have a bulk of the content here that we want to make sure we have consistent text styles. So just referring back to that, body text, so 16 pixels with a line height of 24. So if we set that to 16 and 24 is set there. So already you can see a lot more consistency when it comes to these blocks of text, but there's still a lot more we can do here to improve the overall structure. So next up, probably go the next level above that, which is the heading 4. So which items here would use the heading 4? So we think we're going to go with these 2 headings. So we're in the payment section. So we've got the main heading here, which is payments with a subheading. And then below that, we have the payment methods and payment contact. So these are going to be the heading 4. Again, this is 16 pixels, 24 line height. The only difference here from the body text is that we apply a heavier weight. In this case, it's semi-bold. So we can apply that semi-bold here. Okay, and the next level up, as mentioned, we have the payments heading, which would class that as heading 3 in this case, so 20 and 28, again with the semi-bold. Let's go up to 20, 28, semi-bold. Okay. And then the next heading up is the settings here at the top left, which is using heading 2, so that's 24 and 32. And again, that's using semi-bold. And the navigation, we're going to keep the body text style, I think, for now, as that works fairly well. And lastly, we're going to look at the additional text styles here that we have below the body style. So we have an action text for buttons. So in this case, we have one button on page that we're going to apply this to. So we've got 15 and 24. And that is medium width for the button. Okay, so you can see there we have some structure in place. Now, I'm not particularly happy with the way it's used here. I think there's some imbalances when it comes to this UI. These headings feel quite heavy in comparison to the content. And although we want it to frame the page content below it, we don't want it to detract from the information so much that we can't concentrate and focus on what we need to see. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to drop that down to a medium for each heading, reducing that heavy focus on the headings, but still giving it enough difference in weight that it can frame the content below. Now, just for completeness, we're now going to apply the meta text style that we defined earlier. So this is the style with a 14 pixel text size and a 20 pixel line height. And we're going to use this on this badge component, which is telling the user which payment method has been selected as the default option. So because the component has a distinction in terms of shape and it has a background fill, and more crucially, a green background fill that is quite different to the rest of the UI, the focus on there is enough that we don't need to have a consistent style in terms of the body text. So what we can do is we can drop that down to the meta text style, 14 pixels in font size and a 20 pixel line height. And you'll see that feels a lot more natural. As you have that bounding box, you don't need to have such large text within it. It doesn't take long to see the benefits of using a type scale in a consistent way, in particular for data-heavy interfaces, like this one. We can see that the heading styles here across the page are all using the same pattern and treatment. And interestingly, the body text becomes super versatile in these scenarios. So we can pick out here for this subtext, for these tabs, for these table heading labels and the table content itself. We have this toggle component and let's say this text link. They're all using the body text style from our type scale that we set. But you can see we use different elements and attributes and give them different purposes depending on the scenario. Now, it might be hard to believe, but we only used a total of 5 different text styles when it came to this product experience, which just shows you don't need an extensive type scale set up front to design your product or website. In fact, it might be preferable to try and keep things as small and concise as possible, because from a user point of view, it's great. They don't need to learn different page structures and different levels of hierarchy. And from a designer point of view, it's great because you don't have to worry about which styles to use, and you can be confident that the set of text styles that you do have are versatile enough to be spread and used across an entire product experience. It's important to remember that you can make changes to your type scale as you begin to apply it to your designs. Just because you started with a strict scale doesn't mean you can't make changes as things progress. As long as you're applying it consistently using logical patterns, you can always make changes to suit your needs. The second technique we're going to look at is all about making your text scannable and easy for people to process while browsing. It's often said that people don't read the web, they scan it. So by this rule, we must be cognizant of how fast people can skim through text to find what they are searching for. A trick we can use to help with this is spotting uneven line length. You might have noticed paragraphs that have lines of text that are only a single word long. These irregularities are often referred to as orphans, widows, or even rags. If you spot these in your design, making sure you are using an appropriate line length is the first thing to check. A good rule of thumb is around 70 characters per line for larger screens and around 40 for smaller screens. If your line length is good and you still see these irregularities appearing, I'd suggest reviewing the content to make sure it fits suitably within your design. I find that displaying the right content is a collaborative effort, and you should always try to design using real data wherever possible. It's important to remember that the shorter your line length gets, the greater the line height needs to be. So for smaller screens and mobile devices, where the character length for each line is around 40, we will need to add more vertical breathing space in the form of line height to maintain a good level of readability. This all helps towards reducing the cognitive strain on the user while scanning and ultimately making the content easier to understand. The third technique centers around tightening up our text treatment for a better use of space. Two key attributes we can use to control and manipulate the horizontal space within our text are kerning and letter spacing. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking these are the same thing, since their terms are often used interchangeably among designers. The key difference, however, is that kerning refers to manually updating the space between individual characters, whereas letter spacing refers to managing the white space between all letters within a selection. Let's take a deeper look. If we take a look at this heading style, we can start to look at the differences between letter spacing and kerning and how you would apply them in a particular scenario. So, looking at the settings for this heading style, we currently have a letter spacing of 0%. Now, this tends to be the default, and in many cases we can afford to reduce this by 1 or 2% to actually improve the reading experience going forward. So by default, I'll typically drop this down to 1%, and you'll probably find in most cases this actually has a positive effect on the readability. So if we zoom in again, we can see there that it's actually reduced this on a global level for this heading, but there are different parts where you can start to see that actually it's not had the effect that we desired. So a common scenario would be that you might have something like this. So the top bar of the T doesn't quite hang over the O enough compared to the rest of these letter forms. And by that I mean there's a larger space between this T and the O than there is between, let's say, this O and this U, this E and this A, and so on. This all comes down to the letter forms and how they behave differently depending on capitalization and just general ways that the font has been designed. So one thing we might want to do is, although we've got a global -1 letter spacing on this heading, if we select this particular character and reduce it by another few percent, let's say we go to -4%, you can see that's much better in terms of that coupling of these two letter forms. This is quite a common scenario. Again, you might see this with this Y. You may not want to drop it down as much, but perhaps an extra percentage might just give it that tighter feel that makes it feel a lot more consistent. Now, this obviously varies depending on the font that you're using, but if you want to go that extra mile in terms of refining that letter spacing even further, it's definitely worth digging into these different letter forms and applying different kerning values where appropriate. And we can apply this same logic as we go down this page. If we take this body text, for example, you'll see again that the default there is set to 0 for letter spacing, and just by going down -1%, you can see an increase there in that tightness, which just makes things feel a lot more intentional and put together. And a general rule is that the larger the text and potentially the heavier the text, you can afford to go down further in terms of that negative letter spacing. So because this block quote uses a larger font size and a darker shade of grey, that is visually heavier and more impactful, so we can drop that down to a -2, and again you get that consistent feel in terms of that tighter letter spacing throughout this whole interface. So we've gone through a handful of techniques that could well improve your typography styles with minimal effort. Now the final thing to do is to look at how we can implement those into a reusable system, not only within Figma or your design tool of choice, but across the entire build of the product. So design systems and design tokens are buzzwords right now, but they do provide value when used correctly. So the end goal here is to have a consistent set of terms and references that we can use with our engineering teams so that we're always speaking the same language, which makes life much easier when building out our product. So this is a system that I'm working on right now in its infancy, but I wanted to share it with you now to show how you could effectively apply this and use a similar style to make that transition from Figma into Build much easier for larger scale systems. So one of the main goals here is to abstract away from specific values such as size, line height and letter spacing, and create a token name that represents that but is not exclusive to. So we can make changes in future and not have to worry about renaming our tokens. We can simply have those tokens reference these styles, and these styles can change as much as needed and the token will remain consistent. So I've added in this fourth column here on this table, and if we take a look at what that's made up of, we can see that for heading 1, we have a font size of 32 pixels, line height of 40. Now, we have a token name here of font size 500 and a font line height of 700. Now, one of the things to think about here is this is an abstraction. These aren't actual pixel values. We have a key here that represents the relationships between those and what they actually mean. So we have 32 as the font size, and that references 500 on this token scale. Now, zooming out slightly, we can see that we're starting with 100 as 16 pixels. So because this is the primary body text, and if you think back to our scale creation, this was the standard size that we used to build the entire scale from. So it makes sense to keep that as 100 as a solid base. And then we go up in increments based on the increments in the 4-point scale that we're using for our implicit grid system. So because we're using 32 there, we're jumping up all the way up to 500. The line height is 40, so that equates to 700. So you can see the pattern there that we're reusing across each text style to reference that scale that we've created here. So the font weight is operating on a slightly different scale. Now you'll see here we have 3 different weights that we're using in this type scale. So we have regular, medium and semi-bold. So we're just using 3 different values here. So font weight 100 relates to regular, 200 to medium and 300 to semi-bold. So this is of course a work in progress, but I wanted to share it with you now to try and give you some ideas about how you can start to use tokens with your typography styles and open that conversation up with your engineering team and your developers to try and get that shared understanding of how these tokens operate and to build that consistent terminology to create better products. So you could use a plugin within Figma to manage these, and there are different ways you could structure them, but the ultimate goal there is to use this token name in some way within the design system that then would equate to the styling names, whether that's within CSS or within Swift UI, whatever the product is you're building, and you've got that consistent language there that you can use within design and engineering. Hopefully that's given you some insights and inspired you to think critically about your typography styles. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you next week.